I really, really appreciate it. This is super exciting, especially after Sunday morning. So I hope you're all enjoying it. And again, like, here's the announcement time. Boy, we live across the street from like NASA. And so to be able to do a little bit of what our people do regularly in the church is just long overdue and really exciting. And I don't know how much you've seen these windows, but you will certainly see them again differently after we're done. So huge thanks in advance, Steve, for taking your time and sharing your inspiration. And well, I'm not quite sure what you're going to do, but am super excited about it because these are one of the best, like, eye-catching things of our church, and really, really grateful in advance.
All right. Well, thank you. So I guess to lead off, when this project got started 3 years ago, because St. Thomas affiliation with NASA and petrochemical industry and the technology community here in Houston in general, Christine felt very strongly that we needed to incorporate God's world as explored through science into the windows. And that was part of the proposal that went to Mike in the vestry, and it was enthusiastically accepted. So then she turned around and came to me and said, okay, you're in charge of the science, which was very intimidating because I'm an engineer, not a scientist. I know just enough to be dangerous and to, move matter and energy around to make money, but there's a limit to how far that goes in terms of really understanding what's going on behind the scenes. But be that as it may, I'll dive in and try and do my best. So I'm going to lead off with a couple of quotes. First of all, the central quote of the windows, reach out your hand and put it in my side, do not doubt but believe. When I was a kid and growing up, that was taught in Baptist Sunday school as an admonishment to Christ, that Christ is admonishing St. Thomas that he shouldn't have had to have touched. He should have believed without touching. But in the 55 years that since then, I've personally come to believe that that's an invitation for God to reach out and to touch. That faith is faith, but there's nothing wrong with wanting to be able to put your hands on it. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be able to see it. The second one is a quote from Psalms: "On the glorious splendor of your majesty, on your works I will meditate." I know some of the times at St. Thomas that I have enjoyed the most, some of the most spiritual times for me have been some early mornings driving in when I was on vestry to open the church up, and now that I'm a verger to open the church up or to be there for the opening of the church. And coming around Clear Lake with the sun rising over the lake. It's absolutely magnificent sight. And the play of the light on the water is inspirational. Those are the times that I really feel the presence of the Holy Spirit. The last one is a quote from Sir Isaac Newton. In the absence of any other proof, the thumb alone would convince me of God's existence. And we look at our thumb, we take it for granted, but it is a miracle of evolution. The simple structure of being able to reach across your palm with your thumb to grasp something is truly an astounding evolutionary development, evolutionary adaptation. So moving on into the windows themselves. One of the first icons that you see if you look at the windows is this representation of the golden ratio. The golden ratio is also called phi in the Greek alphabet. It's an irrational number. Like pi, that we're all familiar with, the ratio of the circumference of the circle divided by the diameter of the circle. It cannot completely be resolved. It goes on forever, and goes on without repeating forever. And like pi also, the golden ratio phi seems to be coded into many structures in nature. And it's not widely taught in school as much as pi is, because pi tends to show up a lot more in algebra and in geometry, but phi is a really, really interesting ratio. It's mathematically defined as two line lengths, so a line length A and a line length B, added together. The sum of those lengths over the length of the longer of the two equals the ratio of the longer one over the shorter one. And that seems a little involved, but it sets up an algebra problem, the solution to which is A over B, A side over B is 1.618. It's the phi number, the phi ratio. Now, that in itself is kind of cool that particular problem has got that explicit solution. But it can also be approximated by something called a Fibonacci sequence. It's a really simple little number game that was invented a few hundred years ago. You start out with a 0 and a 1, and then the next number in the sequence is generated by adding the prior two. So you started with 0 and 1, so 1 plus 0 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, so on and so forth. And that can go on forever. So as that sequence progresses, the ratio of any number and its immediate predecessor approaches the value of phi. That's neat, I think. So as you go, 1 over 1 equals 1, 2 over 1 equals 2, 3 over 2 equals 1.5, so on and so forth, you get out to 34 over 21, and you're almost equal to phi of 1.619. As the progression proceeds to infinity, the ratio is approached with infinite accuracy. So the Fibonacci sequence is a geometric progression that approximates, or it has the value of phi built into it. That seems a little esoteric, but there is an actual reason that I brought that particular example up. And that's exploring phi in nature, examples of where that shows up in nature. So flower petals. The number of petals that are on a flower consistently follow the integers of the Fibonacci sequence. So depending on the species, lilies have 3 petals, buttercups have 5, chicory has 21, daisies have 34. All of those numbers appear in the Fibonacci sequence. Seed heads. The seeds begin growing in the center and they migrate out as they grow in spirals to fill all the space that's available in the center of the flower. But if you count the spirals that are taking place, the spirals formed by the seeds, the number of spirals tends to match a Fibonacci number regardless of the species. In this particular case, the way of sunflowers, if you count in this direction, you've got 34 spirals, and if you count in this direction, you've got 21 spirals, both of which are Fibonacci numbers. If you look at a tree or a root system, the way it grows, the main trunk grows until a branch is produced, and that produces 2 growth points. And then one of those new growth points will split again while the other remains dormant as it goes up through another level of the progression of the growth. So as the growth progresses, the total number of branches in the structure follows a Fibonacci sequence. You start with the main, it's at 1, and you get your first split, that's 2. Your next split is 3, your next split's 5, 8, 13, so on and so forth. This is another graphical representation of that's commonly or classically associated with phi. It's called the logarithmic spiral. And you probably have seen some of that like on t-shirts or posters. It's kind of pop culture-ish, I guess. But if you take a rectangle with sides equal to A and B, so the long side being A and the short side being B, if the ratio of those sides equals phi, it allows a nesting progression to take place that can be repeated to infinity and frames what's called a logarithmic spiral. So, for example, you've got the rectangle here, so A over B. You take a slice out of the square of that rectangle, which is the square of sides length B, and you get another golden rectangle. You get another rectangle whose ratio is A over B equals phi. You take that slice out, you get another rectangle, and the ratio of those sides is equal to phi, and so on and so forth. And by drawing an arc through the squares that are produced from one side to the other, just a simple arc like a circle, it will trace what's called the logarithmic spiral. That logarithmic spiral is a structure that shows up frequently in nature. It's ubiquitous in nature. It shows up in shells, it shows up in weather patterns, it shows up in the shapes of galaxies. So Phi is a fascinating number to me. It seems to be actually encoded into nature, and when I look at it, I see the planning and the mind of God at play.
I'd like to see.
There's a neat little YouTube video here. It takes about 5 minutes to watch, but it goes through a lot more examples of phi in natural structures. So let's see if this comes off okay. Is it still sharing? Okay, good.
Stephen, can you try maximizing your, there you go.
Okay.
Just stay
Not a bad question at all. Just
Pastor, just stay.
Okay. So, Mike, how do you want to do questions at the end? Do you want to do comment or just, we're all adults, so we'll just speak up if we want to?
You know what might be best is if we just like we did on Sunday, if we start to in chat do questions, and then you can choose to pick them up whenever you want. And that way, if you think of a question, then you can put it down and not forget it. And Steve, then you can do it whenever you want. Does that seem good?
That'll be great. Yeah.
Comments as well, right? I mean, if you choose to put a comment in, just put it into chat, and then everybody can see it and do whatever they want with it.
So another icon or Easter egg, I guess, that's in that first window is the second law of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is the study of heat, the study of energy, and how heat and energy moves and interacts with the physical world. The first law of thermodynamics states that the total energy of any system and its surroundings, and that goes all the way out to include the entire universe, is considered together is constant. So basically, you can't create energy, you can't destroy energy, you can change energy's form, but the amount of energy that's available in a system is constant when the system is in isolation. In addition to energy, though, there is another intrinsic property in any system that's called entropy, and it can be thought of as a measurement of the system's approach to an equilibrium state. So the total amount of energy that's in a system doesn't change. However, as processes go on in that system, energy becomes more uniformly distributed through the system. And so as it becomes more uniformly distributed, it can no longer do any work. And as it becomes distributed, the measurement of that distribution is entropy. So as energy is distributed, energy doesn't go down. As energy is simply distributed, entropy goes up. So all natural processes cause an increase in the total entropy as they proceed to some kind of an equilibrium end state. So the second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy change of any system and its surroundings considered together is positive, and that change approaches zero for any process as the process approaches equilibrium. So that's an important concept to remember, that entropy never goes down in isolation. It never, when the system is isolated, the entropy of that system can never go down. It's either going to be zero when the system is at equilibrium, or it's going to be increasing if there is a process taking place within that system. So what does that mean in the natural world? So natural processes are never truly reversible or in equilibrium in isolation. Fires don't spontaneously unburn themselves. Water doesn't spontaneously flow uphill. Heat doesn't spontaneously go from cold areas to hot areas. Those are some examples of irreversible processes. However, a system can be acted on from the outside to reset its approach to its equilibrium state. And this is accomplished by adding energy from the outside. So now the system's not in isolation anymore. Something has to go in and reorganize the system. And examples of that would be oxygen is released from carbon dioxide in plants through photosynthesis. So you burned a fire, you make carbon dioxide, but you can reverse that. You can break carbon dioxide back apart by the photosynthesis process, where it takes energy from the sun and splits that molecule back apart again and releases the oxygen. You can pump water uphill. You can carry it in a bucket, but you've got to expend energy to make it happen. You can make a cold area colder, and you can eject that heat into a hot area through refrigeration or air conditioning. Biologically, we extract useful energy to maintain our electrochemical systems. We extract that energy from our environment by eating, drinking, breathing. Basically, we carry on oxidation processes of food inside of our bodies. And that energy is released and utilized by our cells to self-repair themselves. So the localized entropy of our bodies is controlled by extracting energy from our surroundings at the expense of increasing the entropy in our environment. So you take food in, it's in an organized state, you process that food, you expel the waste. The process increases the entropy of the world allowing you to maintain some kind of a steady state of zero entropy or zero entropy change in your body. Death occurs when useful energy is no longer available, either through deprivation, starvation, or because of the breakdowns of the mechanisms. It's not a perfect system. Entropy still plays into it. And as we age or as we get sick, cells don't repair themselves as effectively as they once did. And systems ultimately start to break down until they can't self-repair anymore, and we meet death. Upon death, the structures of that biological system, they immediately begin to decay back to their disordered, undifferentiated components. So in other words, they begin to approach that low energy, or that uniform distribution of energy equilibrium state. The Bible quote that strikes me on this, or that I think is appropriate for this discussion, is God tells us this in Genesis: by the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground. Since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and unto dust you will return. We have to expend energy. It's our fate as mortals to maintain ourselves. So another larger scale version of this, or discussion to be had here, is the heat death of the universe. If you carry this to its ultimate extent, the ultimate end state, all systems naturally tend towards a point where all the useful work has been extracted from the system. All the total amount of energy, as I said, doesn't change, but it becomes uniformly distributed through the system. So there's no difference anymore from one side of the system to the other. There's no driving force to make things happen anymore. Ultimately, the universe in the far, far, far distant future will reach a state of uniform entropy, uniform energy distribution. Stars will convert all of the available light elements into heavy ones and can no longer support fusions. Radioactive elements will decay into lighter, stable ones, and radioactive decay will begin to break down. The universe will tend to a uniform cold state where nothing changes anymore. And this is the ultimate expression of equilibrium. Without that differentiation, here and there is the same, this and that is the same, chaos is maximized because there's no longer anything left to order. It's all uniform. The Bible quote that I like to reference on this particular concept is, "In the beginning, Lord, you laid out the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hand. They will perish, but you remain. They all wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe, like a garment they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will never end." From Hebrews. All right, going to the Holy Spirit window. We have a representation in that window of the DNA molecule. DNA is ubiquitous to all cellular life on Earth. All cellular life on Earth uses DNA to encode the structures and the mechanisms for life and for maintaining that life. There is another arguable life form on Earth that doesn't use DNA, it uses RNA, and that's viruses. I say arguable because viruses in some camps aren't really considered to be alive. They're like genetic bombs. They hijack cells, that's why they need us to replicate, and they use that RNA to transmit the mechanisms, transmit the instructions into those cells to replicate themselves. RNA is used on cellular life as a means of carrying information and moving information around the cell from the DNA to the mechanisms. So what viruses do is they inject that RNA into that system and they hijack it. But DNA is the system that is ubiquitous to all life and determines how plants and animals function and change and evolve. The Bible quote that I'm always struck by when I think about this and my body in general, all bodies, all biological functions. For it was you that formed my innermost parts, knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. From Psalms. There's a neat video that I found on the internet that I think is graphically shows this Bible verse in action, and that is a 16-hour time lapse to about 30 seconds of a zebrafish embryo developing, where it was in a Nikon picture competition. You can actually watch the nervous system of the fish knitting itself together. So let's pull this one up. there's no sound. So Mike, are these videos coming through okay? They're working out? Good, okay. All right, I spoke a little bit about DNA and how DNA regulates mechanisms of the cell for synthesizing proteins. This video here is a discussion of DNA transcription and how cells synthesize proteins for self-maintenance and for growth using the code in DNA.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary
Can you maximize
to
here?
every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
Okay, there is one other video here that is kind of neat. It's about cellular division and the way that DNA is copied and then pulled apart in the process of mitosis between two cells. We can go ahead and watch that one, or we can skip on. What's your pleasure, everybody? Raise hands. If you want to watch it, raise your hand. If you don't want to watch it,
Maybe move on for time's sake.
okay. All right. It was about 50-50, so we'll go ahead and move on. These videos will be available in the file, and we'll distribute the file. All right, moving on to the Holy Spirit window, Maxwell's laws. These are the laws describing electromagnetic phenomenon. There are 4 laws. And Lila, feel free to unmute and dive in if I mangle this, and I probably will because it's not my field of expertise at all. But the first law describes the relationship between the electrical field and electric charges that cause the field. The second law describes the nature of the magnetic field. The third law describes how a time-varying magnetic field creates an electric field and vice versa. So that describes the operating principle behind electrical generators, for example, how a rotating magnet creates a varying magnetic field which induces an electrical field in a nearby wire and produces electrical current. And you've also seen the demonstration where in elementary school they put the wire around the nail and they can put a current through the wire and the nail becomes magnetized. So that's the third law in action. The fourth law is the one that's really interesting. The fourth law, to me anyway, it describes how the coupled magnetic field and the electric field, they self-propagate in time and space. So as the magnetic field is generated and oscillates in time, as it oscillates in one direction, the electric field oscillates in a perpendicular direction, and they propagate through time and space at the speed of light. That's called the electromagnetic wave. And all light is electromagnetic in nature. Actually, all light is electromagnetic radiation. Visible light is only a very, very small part of the spectrum. Our eyes have evolved to see between roughly about 390 nanometers and about 750 nanometers in the wavelength range. But the electromagnetic spectrum goes as far down or as far up as you want to go. It extends to infinity in both directions. So that's neat in and of itself. Light being the very first of God's creations, the very first thing that he did out of the box was let there be light, and there was light. What is an interesting thought that I invite people to noodle around a little bit is a thought concerning Maxwell's laws and the mind and the soul. Our brains are electrochemical machines. They transfer information and signals between neurons through electrical pulses. And those pulses are transient in nature. They're not on all the time. They're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. So Maxwell's third law states that a transient electrical pulse will generate a magnetic field. And the fourth law states that the magnetic field and the electric field are self-sustaining. They're coupled, and they propagate at the speed of light in all directions. So by extension, all brain activity generates a detectable electromagnetic signature. And you see this when you go to the hospital for an EEG. The electroencephalogram, it monitors the electrical activity of the brain, but it doesn't stick electrodes into your brain to get the signal. These are electrodes that are non-invasive. They're outside of your body, and they can detect that electrical signal, that electrical activity inside your body, because they are detecting the electromagnetic signature of that electrical activity. So consider that every thought, every dream, every instinct, every experience ever processed by a nervous system, and not just people, this is all life, is recorded on the electromagnetic background of the universe as a sphere of electromagnetic signals that expand out from that organism that are generating it. So around me, there is a sphere of electromagnetic energy that is 55 light years in radius and is expanding and will expand until my nervous system shuts down. That records some kind of a signal that is specific to my experience of the universe. And that signal will continue forever as part of the electromagnetic background of the universe. It will always be there. The signal will attenuate as the sphere grows. It'll become ever weaker and weaker, but it will never go away. It will always be part of the universe. So the experience of all life is recorded on the firmament of the universe itself. Just food for thought.
Well, I was hoping some of those thoughts would just disappear that I've had.
It's all recorded, sorry.
Part of the background radiation.
All right, right, so moving on to the Good Shepherd window, fractals. One of the spheres, the orbs that we put into that is the fractal. It was there to represent mathematics, but it's also there to represent just the nature of fractals in general. A fractal is a curve or a geometric figure, each part of which is statistically similar in character to the whole. So fractals are useful when modeling structures like natural structures like coastlines and snowflakes and things that have similar patterns that recur at progressively smaller scales within that structure. They're also useful for describing chaotic or random phenomena such as crystal growth. People experiment with them for describing fluid turbulence. They've experimented with them in trying to describe galaxy formation. Probably the most pop culture recognizable fractal is the Mandelbrot set, widely published or widely became popular in the late 80s. I've gone into way too much detail on how the Mandelbrot set is generated here, so I'll leave that up to you guys to read. Suffice it to say that there's a very simple formula. Z of one iteration equals a number of the previous iteration squared plus some number. That's all there is to the Mandelbrot set, the actual mathematics that generates it. The picture is generated by how you treat the output of this equation. And I'll go into more detail on that if anybody wants me to, but one of the things that is really neat about the Mandelbrot set is that by zooming in, so by taking the limits of this graph and by setting these limits to progressively smaller and smaller values and then repeating the process, you can zoom into the structure. As you move into the structure, you see this shape reappear out of the chaos of the structure as you move into progressively smaller and smaller scales of the structure. And it goes on to infinity, or at least as far as we've been able to go with modern computing power. People have done zoom-ins that have taken months of computing power to accomplish and still not found an end to them, a mathematical end to them. So here is a neat demonstration of that zoom-in type effect. You can see we're diving into the structure, and these chaotic patterns appear at the interface. You go deeper and you go deeper and you go deeper, and there's beauty here. It's a neat and engaging thing, but boom, suddenly the Mandelbrot set shape itself reappears. And you continue to dive in. There's more detail, there's more chaotic structures. Some structures are similar, but they don't repeat exactly. But as you continue to dive in deeper and deeper into the structure, eventually you get to a point where a Mandelbrot set reappears. And there it is. So looking at this and playing with this mathematically, I've written computer code to do it myself. It's a fun way to, for a geek to spend time. But thinking about this and tying it into our Creator, Christ said, "Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself, but must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." So we are in God and God is in us, just like the Mandelbrot set is within itself. Another interesting thought, and this came from an interview in Forbes magazine by an interview of Vern Polthress. He's a professor at Westminster Seminary and a mathematician, and he wrote a book called God and Mathematics, talking about fractals, specifically in mathematics in general. So where did this organization and beauty come from? Some might say that the computer generated the image. After all, the computer was used to produce the graphs displayed. But the computer did not create the fractal. It only produced a representation of the fractal that humans can enjoy. A representation of a thing is not the thing itself. God alone can take credit for transcendent truths, such as mathematics. Mathematic truths can be discovered by the human mind, but they are not invented by human thought. They are independent of human values, perceptions, and preconceptions. They are written into the operating code of the universe, and we exist within them. We do not invent them. We can discover them as an explorer discovers a new island, but they are independent of discovery. They are everywhere, omnipresent. They are always, they're eternal. They cannot be defied or defeated. They're omnipotent. And they are rational and have language characteristics to them, which makes them personal. Omnipresent, omnipotent, eternal, and personal. It sounds like God. Professor Polythres is saying that math is an extension of the mind of God. Isaac Newton had an interesting quote, as a blind man has no idea of colors, so we have no idea how the all-wise God perceives and understands all things. So in the Good Shepherd window also there is a representation of the Schrodinger equation. The Schrodinger equation is a representation of the dual nature of matter as being both a wave and a particle simultaneously. It was discovered, developed back in the early 20th century. It basically states that physical systems at the quantum level have no definite properties prior to being observed, prior to being measured. We can predict the properties that the measurement will produce, certain results prior to the actual observation, but the actual observation of the system affects the system. It causes these probabilities to reduce to only one possible value at the moment of observation. It's a little bit of an odd concept, but there's a pretty neat video from Nova off PBS on it, so I'll go ahead and play it.
You'd expect that if I roll a few of these balls down the lane, they'll either be stopped by the barrier or pass through one or the other slit and hit the screen at the back. And in fact, that's just what happens. Those balls that make it through always hit the screen directly behind either the left slit or the right slit. The double slit experiment was much like this, except instead of bowling balls, you use electrons, which are billions of times smaller. You can picture them like this. Let's see what happens if I throw a bunch of these balls. When electrons are hurled at the two slits, something very different happens on the other side. Instead of hitting just two areas, the electrons land all over the detector screen, creating a pattern of stripes, including some right between the two slits, the very place you'd think would be blocked. So, what's going on? Well, to physicists, even in the 1920s, this pattern could mean only one thing: waves. Waves do all kinds of interesting things, things that bowling balls would never do. They can split. They can combine. If I sent a wave of water through the double slits, it would split in two, and then the two sets of waves would intersect. Their peaks and valleys would combine, getting bigger in some places, smaller in others, and sometimes they cancel each other out. With the height of the water corresponding to brightness on the screen, the peaks and valleys would create a series of stripes and what's known as an interference pattern. So how could electrons, which are particles, form that pattern? How could a single electron end up in places a wave would go?
Particles are particles, waves are waves. How can a particle be a wave? Unless you give up the idea that it's a particle and think, aha, this thing that I thought was a particle was actually a wave. A wave in an ocean? That's not a particle. The ocean is made out of particles, but the waves in the ocean are not particles. And rocks are not waves. Rocks are rocks. So a rock is an example of a particle. An ocean wave is an example of an ocean wave. And Now somebody's telling you a rock is like an ocean wave. What?
Back in the 1920s, when a version of this experiment was first done, scientists struggled to understand this wavy behavior. Some wondered if a single electron, while in motion, might spread out into a wave. And the physicist Erwin Schrödinger came up with an equation that seemed to describe it.
Schrödinger thought that this wave was a description of an extended electron, that somehow an electron got smeared out, and it was no longer a point, but was like a mush.
There was a lot of argument about exactly what this represented.
Finally, a physicist named Max Born came up with a new and revolutionary idea for what the wave equation described. Born said the wave is not a smeared out electron or anything else previously encountered in science. Instead, he declared it's something that's really peculiar, a probability wave. That is, Born argued that the size of the wave at any location predicts the likelihood of the electron being found there.
Where the wave is big, that's not where most of the electron is. That's where the electron is most likely to be.
And that's just very strange, right? So the electron on its own seems to be a jumble of possibilities. You're not allowed to ask, where is the electron right now? You are allowed to ask, if I look for the electron in this little particular part of space, what is the likelihood I will find it there? I mean, that bugs anyone, anytime.
As weird as it sounds, this new way of describing how particles like electrons move is actually right. When I throw a single electron, I can never predict where it will land. But if I use Schrödinger's equation to find the electron's probability wave, I can predict with great certainty that if I throw enough electrons, then say 33.1% would end up here, 7.9% would end up there, and so on. These kinds of predictions have been confirmed again and again by experiments. And so the equations of quantum mechanics turn out to be amazingly accurate and precise, so long as you can accept that it's all about probability.
So reading a little bit more about this, there was a physicist, Werner Heisenberg. He wrote a book, Physics and Beyond, in 1971. He was a student of the family of physicists that developed quantum mechanics in the 1920s and 30s, but quite famous in his own right. I'm sure you might have heard of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle when you were in school. Forgotten what it was about, but probably heard the name. But at any rate, he has a quote from his book. He says, this difficulty relates to the question whether the smallest units of matter, such as atoms, of which we and all objects are composed, are ordinary physical objects, whether they exist in the same way as stones or flowers. Here, quantum theory has created a complete change in the situation. The smallest units of matter are, in fact, not physical objects in the ordinary sense of the word. They are, in Plato's sense, ideas. There's another scientist, he's a physicist, also teaches theology in the University of Jerusalem. He's written several books, one of them, God According to God, in 2009. The Bible informs us that wisdom, information, is the substrate, the basis of existence. Wisdom is as fundamental to our universe as time and space. So I went and looked up the definition of wisdom in the Webster's Dictionary. And one of the definitions is the ability to discern inner quantities or relationships, which I was kind of taken by, because when you go to the Bible, Proverbs has some very interesting things to say about wisdom, as does the book of Job. I, wisdom, together with prudence, I possess knowledge and discretion. The Lord brought me forth at the first of his works. Before his deeds of old, I was formed long ages ago at the very beginning, when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water, before the mountains were settled into place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the world or the fields or the dust of the earth, I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep. when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the foundations of their deep, when he gave the sea its boundaries so that the waters could not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. From the book of Proverbs. And from the book of Job, where does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living being, concealed even from the birds of the sky. Death and destruction say only a rumor of it has reached our ears. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells, for he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under heaven. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and the path of the thunderstorm, he looked at wisdom and appraised it, and he confirmed and tested it. That's the end of my presentation. So everybody is still muted. Do I unmute people or do they unmute themselves?
We can do it either way. We can unmute ourselves, which probably is good if we want to share. If you want to, Steve, you can hit stop sharing screen, and then we'll be able to see everybody at one time.
Okay. So we've got the chat.
And I knew there was one question that the Delgados pinned, and it asked, how does the first and second law of thermodynamics apply to the universe as a whole?
Arguably, and Lila, you're a professional physicist, so I'm gonna throw you under the bus here. But you know, the universe as a whole is an enclosed system. So the amount of energy that's present in the universe was the amount of energy that was released at the first moment of creation of the Big Bang. Now that energy, and Einstein shows us, and Paul talked about it last Sunday, you know, can't condense into matter, and matter and energy are related through E equals mc squared, the famous Einstein equation. But the amount of energy that is present, either as electromagnetic energy or potential energy or chemical energy or condensed matter, it has not changed since the first moment of creation.
And I think you've got it spot on there, and also in your description of how the universe winds down to that maximum chaos.
So, you know, at that first moment of creation, arguably you've got the most potential present. So one could say that entropy was zero at that moment. Everything was potential. But as the universe expands and as the processes proceed, as matter condenses, as stars are born and burn, as space continues to expand and cool off, energy becomes more spread out at lower and lower, less useful levels. And those pockets of useful concentrated energy, ultimately, as the universe progresses, will eventually become spread out so that it's no longer useful. And when that takes place, natural processes will stop. And that will be the moment of maximum entropy.
And that idea is what gives us the concept that time does have an arrow.
Right.
Because if you look at one state of the universe and it has less entropy than another, then you know that one happened later.
Another interesting.
I mean, there's
back to your question, build on the question a little bit. So if we have a closed universe where the universe starts collapsing back again, how does that, is that still entropy still going up?
Well, and I'm going to have to toss a professional physicist under the bus on this one, because I think that thermodynamics says that the universe can't collapse. I think people, and once again, I need a professional astrophysicist to come in on this, because I know that we've always talked about the options that either it will eventually slow down and begin to collapse under its own gravity, or it's somehow stagnant, or it will continue to expand. And I think what has been shown is that not only is it expanding, but that expansion is accelerating as we move forward in time.
That's the latest evidence.
So, you know, and going back to thermodynamics, if the universe were to collapse and become hot again, it would seem to reverse entropy, which doesn't really line up with the rest of the physical universe.
I'll tell you how I think we get out of that. And let me just say I'm not actually an astrophysicist. We need Paul for that. I'm more general. But when you crunch back down, what you've created another singularity, which means you can't know what happened before then. It's not very satisfying to say that. It's like, oh, it's a do-over.
So Lila, though, you did mention something about the arrow of time. When I was reading about the Schrodinger wave equation, another interesting observation came out about the arrow of time as it relates to the collapse of the probability wave. In a way, that marks the forward direction of time, because once the wave of probabilities have collapsed into an observation, it can't be undone. You can't go back to the probabilities again. So that's another way of thinking that time only moves in one direction.
There's the concept that the laws of physics that Lyle is really referring to, time in the laws of physics doesn't say you can't run one direction versus running a reverse direction, but entropy would provide an arrow to time,
yeah,
in a sense. The other thing I was going to say about the first and second laws of thermodynamics is at least in the engineering community, the first law says that you can't win, and the second law says you can't even break even.
and you can't quit.
And you can't quit.
The third law says you can't stop playing the game.
Quit, yeah.
Okay, I got to ask you a question, though. I'm going to ask Paul this one, too, right? Because Hawking says, like you've said, the arrow of time points toward entropy. But if I remember correctly, Martin Luther King Jr. says that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. So those seem to be mutually exclusive claims in my mind. And I'm just curious what the physicists on the screen make of those.
Go ahead, Lyle.
Go ahead. Well, it's just, God is a creator, and we're made in the image of God as creators as well. And so we can create justice and equality, regardless of what the atoms are doing. And I think that's our job, actually. We create. We do.
I would like to think that, the universe is not a truly enclosed system, isolated system, that God is the outside force that acts from the outside to move things along, if I want to be theologically philosophical about it. However, if I want to be realistically cynical about it, and I can go both ways, depending on what I had for breakfast, you talk about the arc of history moving towards justice, but if you really look at history in the long view, civilizations rise and fall. Chaos reintroduces itself into human constructs and human civilizations at a fairly regular clockwork period. I don't think that we strive towards justice. We don't like to. We need to. It's part of our nature to build these systems and these civilizations, but they don't endure forever.
I think my way of looking at it is that the material things that are created come and go. But if you look in the long range, then perhaps the spirit of man is moving, or humans is moving in a direction of hopefully better things. In the sense that, that slavery existed in a lot of places and in the early empires, and we've come to the belief that isn't good. We've had things like the age of reason, the age of enlightenment over darker times. And my hope is that the arrow, or I believe, is that the arrow of human understanding and progress is moving forward, even if empires and material things come and go. It's the ideas that survive.
I have a
question.
Yes, ma'am.
It was my understanding that only God can create, and what man can do is discover. How does that fit into what scientists do?
Well, I guess others will want to answer that too, but you know, there's been this discussion about, for instance, in mathematics, and Steve had, you know, some quotes about it, excellent quotes about it is, you know, when we come up with another branch of mathematics, are we creating something, or are we really discovering something? And that's been a question among mathematicians and people over time. Now, part of the reason we can come up with something is the fact that God has given us the ability to do that. And in the future, there may be, you know, maybe leading towards evolution. Maybe there's another species that will have greater capacity than we do and reach greater understandings. And maybe our ancestors will, or our, you know, the folks that follow us will have a better understanding.
Thank you.
You know, you know, I'm a chemical engineer. You know, I make my living building and designing and operating chemical plants. I'm not aware of any process that we use to manipulate energy and matter that doesn't already exist. In nature, we learn how to use them, but we didn't invent them. We didn't create them. They were there from the first moment.
The laws of physics are what they are. It's not like we came up with them.
Exactly. Yeah.
I cannot change the laws of physics, Captain.
I've actually used that quote at work. So.
As a non-scientist in this group, as an artist, I think if we look at art as creative, that we've created something, but I think what it is, we're more synthesizing input that comes to us and giving an output that reflects what we have seen or learned or understood, and the creativity comes in how we express it. If that makes sense.
I've got a quote that I like to use at work, and that's you don't fight with the laws of nature. You dance with the laws of nature. You know, we can't make it do anything that it won't do. We can be clever with how we manipulate those laws, but the laws are the laws, and they're not going to break. They're not going to change for us.
But it's interesting that chemists can talk about a very beautiful synthesis, and physicists can talk about a beautiful equation that explains things. And so in that sense, the sciences are also very creative in putting things together that have beauty.
And you know, I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, you know, for me personally, the most moving times, the times that my soul sings, are the times that I'm seeing, you know, a magnificent sunrise refracted through clouds, or you know, when I'm looking through a telescope and see something magnificent in the nebula, or looking through a microscope and seeing a cell divide. You know, that's when nature, in nature, is where God speaks to me.
Well, I found that one of the really fascinating or terrific things is, in my research, occasionally discovering something and becoming aware that that's something that only God and I know at that moment.
The moment of crystallization, that's a magical moment, and they're all too rare. But I commented to my roommate when I was in school. There are times where we call it choirs of angels. You know, where you're struggling with a concept, you're trying to learn something, and it's just not coming, and you're fighting with it, and you're fighting with it, and you're fighting with it, and then suddenly, maybe you take a nap and you wake up, and it all makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That moment of crystallization is just magical.
Yes.
Mike, what do you have there on the chat?
Well, I just put in linguistically, like in the Hebrew Bible, the verb create is only appended to God. So human beings can't create anything in biblical Hebrew. Humans can make things, but a human being is never an agent of creation. And the neat thing about that, right, is that God creates everything and says it's very good, right? Which means since human beings can't create, they can't uncreate it. They can just abuse it.
But then we were made in the image of God.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that with fractals, right? Because geometrically anyway, there's the pre-image, which is what you start with, and the image is what you get after you rotate and reflect and dilate something. So it's really interesting to think about that in terms of fractals and how God's expression has been rotated and reflected and dilated within us.
That's really the main reason that it appears in the windows.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of my intent was, and I think I wrote it in the chat, that we're like a little teeny tiny piece of God because God's always within us.
My favorite fractal is broccoli, for what it's worth, right? I don't know if anybody's seen the broccoli sketch, but it's a square with a triangle on it. And on the top of each triangle, you draw a square with a triangle.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you keep doing that, you end up with this, curly, this is terrible diagram, but it ends up curly queuing, and that's where you get broccoli from. And to think about that as God's pre-image and us as the image, it's just an interesting geometric way of thinking about that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, this mostly, I guess, would be for Christine. In the process of doing this windows, how did you work with his science and your creativity to put all that together?
Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong about this. I usually come up with a concept of what I want the window to be saying. And since the major theme or a major theme in the windows wanted to be this conversation between science and theology, once I kind of knew I needed something that talked about, like with fractals, God being within us, then I would go to Stephen and say, okay, what do you know about in science that kind of expresses this? And for the doors that we're working on now, they are expressive of God the Creator as Omega and Alpha, or Alpha and Omega. And so I asked him for some formulas that had to do with the chaos of the creation versus Omega, kind of the resolution of the kingdom of God. And so we've tried to find formulas, like we're using Kepler's laws in the Omega door, because I said this has to talk about, the order that God brings to the universe. And so we thought, okay, Kepler talks about the motions of the planets and that kind of thing. So I usually kind of come up with the big picture stuff, and then he figures out how to make it work.
Thank you.
That's pretty much our whole married life.
Thank you.
Actually, that's really true. I just realized that.
Well, it's certainly a beautiful and very inspiring result. I love to sit and meditate in the chapel.
That's true. It is really, really beautiful.
Thank you.
And thank you for the gift, Stephen, of being able to hear what's in your mind. To me, one of the most amazing things about art is the way that it can speak to us individually, and the way that when we hear how it speaks to one another and the origins of it, that that's just another standalone. You know, it's not a replacement for what the art does to me. It's a conversation. And so you've expanded my conversation with the window, which was a really good one already, by the way.
I think that one of the things I appreciate too about the project that I don't know if we talk about a whole lot is just in terms of it being in that space and how stained glass can have a real kind of architectural effect, you know, and I think the fact, you know, that it covers that entire wall and that you're in a fairly intimate space with it really makes it feel different than like out in the nave. And that's one of the things that I've always enjoyed about stained glass and stained glass installations is the architectural impact of the craft.
Well, if it's okay, what I'd like to do, Steve, is say, as always, if you come up with other questions from Steve's presentation, or if you say, hey, would you send me the presentation here, I can do that. I don't want to speak for you, but I imagine if people have questions for you that come to them later, you'd be willing to return to them.
Yeah.
And this is just a really, again, I privately chatted with Lila for a second here. It's fun. This is, you know, the idea for this is 5 years in the making, and I sure am enjoying the month of July on Zoom, even though it's kind of miserable outside. So thank you all for being a part of it, because this is not my native language, but it's expansive. It's really fun, and what a great follow-up to talk about the infinite electromagnetic waves that come out of our cognition. That's I'm going to spend some more time on that. And that other really interesting thing, that quote from Heisenberg that I wrote down, that the smallest blocks are ideas. That's these are really, I think, powerful ways, again, to think about things like not just the moment of creation, but about things like faith and hope and love, the things that the Apostle Paul says endure forever. So I really appreciate you giving some scientific ways to experience that. So everybody, sorry.
Would it be possible to get a copy of that PowerPoint?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love
I would
that.
love to have that. That was
Me
so
too.
good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Me too. Thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Stephen. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll send a copy of the PowerPoint to everybody I think is on the screen, and if I don't get you, then yell at me. And I look forward to seeing you Sunday morning with Paul Cloutier.
The windows are beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Well, the last two are going to revive anytime. Probably they'll get here before we do because of COVID. That's okay. So we'll come in. Yeah, well, it could be a long time, Christine, so that may not be a big rush.
You know, you're not supposed to say that to me, because then
we need them this week.
I'm deadline challenged.
Yeah, right.
Great job, Stephen.
Thank you, Steve.
Awesome.
Bye.
Bye. Very nice. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, y'all.